suicide prohibitions cannot be morally justified using secular values. I'll say that again. Suicide prohibitions cannot be morally justified utilizing secular values. So suicide is not illegal per se. It's not technically illegal. However, in the United States, suicide is effectively illegal because if somebody tries to engage in suicide or is planning to with a definite plans, means, and intention, they can be locked up against their will potentially in a locked hospital psychiatric ward. So in this sense, suicide is illegal because if you get caught trying and failing to engage in it, or planning to do it in a definite way, you can get locked up effectively in a so-called hospital psychiatric unit. If we lived in a theocracy, then suicide prohibitions can be rationalized. If somebody engages in suicide and goes to hell, then forcing them not to engage in suicide is better than their soul burning for eternity. So in a theocracy, if we lived in a Christian theocracy, a Judeo-Christian theocracy, you could logically prohibit suicide. Now, if you want to live in a just secular society that respects the rule of law and personal autonomy, then suicide prohibitions cannot be morally justified. Things like hurting others can be morally justified because as moral agents, as unique humans, we have a right in a just society to be free from injustices. So being harmed by others and harming others is rightfully, logically, and morally prohibited, even if we are living in a secular society. If we want to live in a peaceful, secular society that is democratic and adheres to principles like justice and freedom and liberty and personal responsibility, the rule of law, having just laws and repealing unjust laws, you can morally justify property rights and not harming others or being harmed. However, harm to self, if we want to have principles like freedom and liberty and autonomy in a secular society, then suicide needs to be respected as a civil and human right for adults when it is done in private, if we want to live in a just secular society. So the United States is not a Christian nation, so some of the founding fathers have said, and I believe court rulings have affirmed this. We are supposedly a secular democracy, a secular republic in the United States here. Abortion, Roe versus Wade, women have body rights. They're able to do what they want with their body based on what they deem best for themselves. So they have body autonomy, their body, their choice. Why with suicide are adults not given the same freedom and body autonomy? Your body, your choice. Well, the reason, sort of historically and logically and how it is because of the language we use for mental illness. We medicalize it. There's a term where people don't know they have a mental illness. It's like anagnosia, and that's very dehumanizing. If people want to engage in suicide, they have reasons for wanting to engage in suicide. And I'm not saying that suicide is a good thing. Let me be very clear. I'm not saying that people should engage in suicide or that it's a good thing. I'm simply saying we should not forcibly stop adults from engaging in suicide in private. We should not forcibly stop adults from engaging in suicide in private. We should respect suicide as a civil and human right for all adults when it's done in private. Read the book Suicide Prohibition, The Shame of Medicine by psychiatrist Thomas Szasz. Read the book Fatal Freedom, The Ethics and Politics of Suicide by psychiatrist Thomas Szasz. Fatal Freedom, The Ethics and Politics of Suicide by psychiatrist Thomas Szasz. And Szasz is spelled S-Z-A-S-Z. Sam, zebra, apple, Sam, zebra. Psychiatrist Thomas Szasz. We should, in my opinion, try to reduce suicides. We should try to use persuasion, reason, and kindness so no adult wants to engage in suicide. Rather than using psychiatric force, coercion, and confinement, we should use persuasion, reason, and kindness. In the last 20-25 years in the United States, the suicide rate has increased significantly, as I understand it. So, if psychiatry is a medical specialty that is actually helpful, why has the suicide rate gone up significantly over the last 20-25 years? We medicalize suicide. Rather than think of suicide as a personal, philosophical, moral choice, we medicalize it. Suicide is also a spiritual and theological issue. Again, one more reason why a secular society has no business prohibiting it. Suicide is a spiritual and theological issue. Suicide involves the afterlife because suicide ends one's life on earth. So therefore, within that personal, moral, and existential choice, that philosophical, moral, spiritual, existential choice, there is a spiritual component to suicide, because when somebody successfully engages in it, maybe they, if they're an atheist, they just go to dust and there's nothing. If they're a Buddhist, maybe they have an idea of what happens after life. If they're Hindu or agnostic or whatever, they may have a view about what may happen after suicide. Chances are any adult who is trying to or does or is going to engage in suicide feels that whatever happens after suicide is probably better than living on earth. People, when they engage in suicide, they're often in a lot of emotional pain. They've often had maybe trauma. They maybe have a lot of problems in living that they find really, really, really difficult to solve, or they feel like they're unsolvable. There may be personal tragedy. There's a good chance there's personal tragedy. When people engage in suicide, they usually have reasons for engaging in it or trying to engage in it. And I do think we should offer copious amounts of help to those that are considering engaging in suicide. We just should not use psychiatric force, coercion, and confinement on them. Universal basic income might go a long way in reducing suicides. Additionally, if we outlawed psychiatric force, coercion, and confinement, if we outlawed nonconsensual psychiatry, I think it's quite possible that adults will be more willing and feel more able to have private, confidential discussions about suicide in appropriate settings, whether that's with a pastor or a priest or a monk or a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist or whatever. If we outlaw psychiatric force, coercion, and confinement, if we outlaw non-consensual psychiatry, people may be able to talk more openly and honestly about their feelings and thoughts related to suicide. This could then help us find ways to help them solve their problems, or to, if there's a very common theme in society of reasons why people are wanting to engage in suicide, maybe we can change society in a way so society is more conducive to emotional well-being. Just a theory. Suicide involves spiritual and theological components. It can, or in the case of an atheist, maybe it doesn't, in which case, especially if we want to have freedom of religion in this country, well, an atheist, if they just think their body goes to nothing and they're suffering on earth, well, they should be allowed to engage in suicide and not have their human rights abused when they're trying to seek help. Psychiatric human rights abuses need to be outlawed. There's a whole psychiatric survivors movement. People that feel like they've been harmed by psychiatry, traumatized by psychiatry, abused by psychiatry. Psychiatrist Thomas Szasz writes about how psychiatric coercion and nonconsensual psychiatry is a form of torture. Nonconsensual psychiatry can be torture, and nonconsensual psychiatry can result in death because neuroleptics, aka major tranquilizers, aka antipsychotics, which is a marketing term, by the way. They were originally called neuroleptics, which means to seize the brain, and major tranquilizers. Antipsychotic drugs have side effects that can potentially result in death. Neuroleptic malignant syndrome. Tardive dyskinesia won't result in death directly, but it's a permanent movement side effect, sort of like Parkinson's. But as far as what can result in death, neuroleptic malignant syndrome, arrhythmias that can result in heart disease, sudden cardiac death potentially. That's my understanding. Yeah, those are the baddies: neuroleptic malignant syndrome and heart disease. And then also, they can cause weight gain and diabetes, which can lead to death. The books by Thomas Szasz, some of them refer to neuroleptics as creating physical disability. And the book Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker. The book Anatomy of an Epidemic is good. I recommend it sort of as an aside. Talks about how, psychiatric drugs are really sort of misused. A lot of the research is maybe bad or biased or skewed. I recommend checking that out. Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker. Read books by psychiatrist Thomas Szasz, like Cruel Compassion, Suicide Prohibition, Fatal Freedom, Our Right to Drugs, The Myth of Mental Illness, Faith and Freedom, Law, Liberty, and Psychiatry, The Szasz Quotationary, Heresies, The Untamed Tongue. It's good stuff. So yeah, secular values cannot logically, morally support psychiatric coercion. A medicalized theology sort of can, in a sort of Orwellian way, which is what we have now. Theology, if your religion says people go to hell when they die, well, then maybe you can justify torturing them with coercive psychiatry. However, we don't live in a theological society, supposedly, in the United States. We supposedly live in a secular republic. So yeah, suicide prohibitions cannot be morally justified using secular values. And I'll repeat, I don't think suicide is something that should be encouraged. I'm not pro-suicide. I think it will be good if we can reduce suicides to zero using persuasion, reason, and kindness. I'll end it there. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, watch my other videos, visit my websites, listen to my music. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, or night, whenever and wherever you may be. Cheers and limitless peace. Cielo milagros, cielo milagros, cielo milagros.